Country and Western Music. "Hey, good-looking, what you got a-cooking?" sang Hank Williams in his 1951 hit song of the same name. He wore a cowboy hat and a country-style suit. His guitar and voice twanged in a very American way. This music was the commercial version of white American folk music, or, as it was starting to be called, country and western. Of course, it hadn't come out of nowhere. There were some slight Spanish and French influences, and definitely a few African-American contributions. But the heart and soul of the music was from traditional Northern European folk music, especially the ballads of Irish and Scottish music. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a lot of Scottish and Irish people arrived on the east coast of America and then settled in the little valleys of the eastern mountain ranges, such as the Ozarks and Appalachians, where they lived very isolated lives, keeping much of the culture, music, and even the accent that their families had arrived with. Violins or fiddles were very popular instruments because they were small and light, but could give out enough sound for a dance and create a sad atmosphere or an exciting one. Other stringed instruments were adopted, like the Spanish guitar and the African banjo. Though nowadays any instrument can be used in country music, it is the violin and other stringed instruments that create the most typical country sound. Despite the isolation of these hillbilly communities, some church hymns provided new melodies to play, and African tonal influences made an impact as well. Also, many musicians travelled about looking for work at weddings and parties. As they did so, they brought and spread new styles and songs. By the 1920s, when radio and gramophone records were becoming more common, this white folk music was marketed as hillbilly music. Western music, a cousin of hillbilly or country music, was developing in the most Western American states, for example, Texas. In East Texas, close to Alabama and Louisiana, hillbilly sounds were popular, whereas in West Texas, Western or cowboy music was preferred. Western music was a little different to hillbilly in having slightly slower beats and much more use of guitars, which played a lilting sound, a bit like Hawaiian guitar. Western music tended to sing about cowboy stories and horseback adventures. Some of its growing fame in the 20th century came through cinema, where the music could be heard in many of the westerns or cowboy movies that came out in their hundreds. Slow, haunting harmonica solos were especially typical of this music. Although country and western music now stretched across the USA from Virginia to California, in those racially divided days it had a very white audience. As the music-rich decade of the 1960s unfolded, country music was resistant to fusion with other kinds of music, especially black styles like blues and soul, although this changed later. The white image of country music did not stop at its styles and rhythms. The songs, the attitudes, and the politics of the singers and musicians were often conservative or even openly racist, with a strongly sentimental belief in Protestant Christianity. When, in the mid-late 1960s, rock and soul songs protested against the Vietnam War, military conscription, and segregation of the races, country and western artists and their songs often spoke in support of the war and American traditions like color bars at universities. Above all, they showed their contempt for the new, long-haired hippies. This conservatism spread into social questions as well, And just as the women's liberation movement was starting and divorce was becoming more and more common, Tammy Wynette sang "Stand by Your Man," a call to women to stay married no matter what. In all fairness, however, some country and western artists showed, and did not try to hide, more liberal attitudes and anti-racist beliefs. Nonetheless, when the hippies and the new left in the US wrote songs to parody the right wing, they would make the songs country and western. The song, "Don't Bogart That Joint, My Friend," is a celebration of marijuana smoking, but is set to typical Western-style music. And when Graham Parsons and others parodied extreme right-wing DJs and politicians like Ronald Reagan with the lyrics, "He's a truck-driving, beer-drinking man. He's the head of the Ku Klux Klan," they not only used typical country and Western music, they seem to describe the typical country and Western music fan. However, through the 1970s, country and Western became some of the best-selling popular music in the USA and started to win fans outside North America. Also, the music softened politically, and Kenny Rogers sang of the tragedy of the Vietnam War in his hit single, "Ruby," while Dolly Parton said it for working women in her hit song, 9 to 5. As the tensions, racial, social and political, of the 1960s began to fade away, country and Western continued to grow in popularity to what is today a huge and complex style of music, both influencing and influenced by the other sounds around it.